The armies faced each other across the open plain, every soldier tense, every horse snorting and stamping, the air heavy with the smell of dust and iron. Alexander the Great, barely 30, rode among his men with a calm so intense it felt like a storm gathering in silence. Across the field, Darius III's Persian forces stretched endlessly, banners snapping in the wind, thousands of soldiers ready to strike. But even in their numbers, there was hesitation, a crack in the armor of an empire that had ruled for centuries. And right here, my friends, if you want to witness the rise of legends, the clash of empires, and stories that will leave your jaw on the floor, you need to subscribe to the Dark Spire. Don't just watch history, step into it, feel it, and experience it like no one else. Now, here's the thing. Alexander didn't just step onto that plain like any ordinary soldier. No, he moved with the confidence of a man who already knew he was about to change the world. His eyes scanned the Persian army, finding every gap, every hesitation, every weakness, and his cavalry shifted instantly, flowing around the enemy like water taking the shape of a riverbed. The infantry tightened, shields clicking, spears ready. And I'm telling you, at that moment, you could almost feel the air itself holding its breath. The Persian chariots charged, horses screaming, wheels tearing into the dirt. And yet, Alexander's men stood firm, meeting the impact with precision and unshakable discipline. Spears clashed, shields rang, dust swallowed screams, and the chaos of battle roared like a living beast. Every movement Alexander made was calculated, every strike perfect, and the Macedonian army began to slice through the heart of the Persian lines like a blade through silk. Darius, seeing the gap widening, tried to rally his troops. He shouted commands, waved his hands, but the fear was already there. The Macedonians pressed harder, Alexander himself cutting through, leading from the front, unstoppable, relentless. Every charge, every pivot, every clash of metal told a story of courage and genius, a story that would echo for millennia. By the time the dust settled, the Persian army lay broken, their chariots abandoned, standards fallen, soldiers scattered. Alexander didn't just win a battle, he had rewritten the rules of power, and the world had begun to bend to his vision. He stood amidst the chaos, breathing hard, every inch of him alive with the knowledge that history had just been made, and it would never be the same again. The dust of Gaugamela hung thick over the battlefield, curling into the air like smoke from a raging fire, the cries of the fallen echoing across the plain. Alexander's eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept the Persian lines, noting every twitch of a banner, every falter in the chariots, every hesitation among the ranks. His army had already broken the initial assault, yet the work was far from over. The Macedonians could feel the pulse of battle, the living rhythm of chaos and control intertwining beneath their feet, and Alexander knew that victory would not come from numbers alone, it would come from precision, discipline, and a mind that moved faster than any arrow that flew through the air. His cavalry, stationed on the right flank, began a slow but relentless pivot, circling toward the vulnerable center of the Persian formation. The horses' hooves struck the earth in perfect synchronization, the sound carrying like a drumbeat of doom to the enemy. Infantry in the center held fast, shields locking, forming a wall of iron, spears bristling outward like a sea of spikes. Alexander moved along the line, directing, commanding, inspiring. Each word, each gesture, was a spark that ignited determination in the hearts of men who would follow him into the jaws of death without hesitation. The Persian commanders, despite their overwhelming numbers, struggled to coordinate their forces. Chariots collided, horses panicked, and infantry stumbled against one another in confusion. Darius III, observing from his chariot, felt the first real tremors of doubt. Alexander's phalanx had not only held against their initial onslaught, it had begun to cut systematically into their flanks, exploiting every weakness with the precision of a master strategist. Alexander's right wing surged, bending the Persian formation outward, creating a corridor that none of the enemy anticipated. He noticed the faltering of the elite Persian cavalry at the front and seized the opportunity. With a roar, he led a charge directly into the breach, steel flashing, dust rising in clouds around the unstoppable wave of Macedonian soldiers. The shock of the attack reverberated through the Persian lines, and suddenly, the empire that had seemed unshakable was faltering under the weight of disciplined fury. Every step of the Macedonian advance was choreographed chaos. The phalanx advanced in perfect timing, shields moving in unison, spears striking with deadly accuracy. Cavalry units weaved through gaps, striking at officers and disrupting formations, leaving holes that Alexander's infantry could exploit immediately. Persian archers unleashed volley after volley of arrows, but Alexander's shields absorbed, deflected, and redirected them. Each soldier knew exactly when to advance and when to brace. It was a symphony of war, orchestrated by the young king whose mind was as sharp as the swords in his hands. Amidst the chaos, Alexander's attention was unrelenting. He spotted a group of Persian heavy infantry attempting to regroup near the river, forming a secondary line of defense. Without hesitation, he ordered a detachment of cavalry to encircle and trap them, cutting off any escape. The Macedonian horsemen galloped with terrifying speed, cutting across the plain, driving fear and confusion into the hearts of their enemies. Soldiers who had once thought themselves invincible now faltered, some fleeing, some falling under the relentless pressure of a smaller but infinitely more coordinated force. Meanwhile, Alexander's center pressed forward. Spear clashed against shield, and every inch of ground won was hard-fought. Blood stained the earth, and the groans of the wounded rose like a chorus to the sky. But Alexander moved calmly amidst it all, sword raised, shield deflecting, leading from the front as he always did. Every soldier saw him, and every soldier followed him without question, knowing that to falter would mean death, not just for themselves, but for the moment that history demanded they seize. Darius III, now realizing that the Macedonians had fully exploited the gaps, attempted to rally his elite guards. But panic had begun to spread. Fear is contagious, and it moved faster than any order a king can shout. His chariot wove frantically among the fleeing cavalry, trying to restore coherence, but Alexander anticipated this maneuver. With a shift of his own forces, he struck at the Persian rear, cutting communications and isolating sections of the army. The empire that had stood for centuries now splintered under the pressure of one man's vision, one army's discipline, and one leader's unyielding courage. The battle surged on for hours, each moment bringing new acts of heroism, sacrifice, and brutal calculation. Macedonian soldiers charged repeatedly, retreating only to regroup and strike again, while Persian formations fell apart piece by piece. Alexander's genius was not only in attacking, it was in anticipating, in knowing the enemy's fear before it became action, in turning hesitation into defeat. Cavalry swept in from the sides, spears punctured weak points, and every soldier of the Macedonian army seemed to act with the instinct of a predator, coordinated as if guided by the same unyielding mind. By mid-afternoon, the tide was undeniable. Darius III, seeing the collapse of his army and the relentless advance of Alexander, made the fateful decision to flee. His chariot disappeared into the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, leaving soldiers leaderless, disoriented, and vulnerable. Alexander pressed forward relentlessly, cutting through the disorganized ranks, and every victory in that moment became not just a tactical success but a psychological one. Macedonians had turned fear into power, chaos into order, and strategy into legend. The plains of Gaugamela became a testament to courage, planning, and unshakable will. Broken chariots, fallen banners, and the wounded littered the ground, while Alexander stood amidst it all, surveying what had been achieved. Not through numbers alone had he won, nor through the arrogance of a single strike, but through vision, discipline, and the relentless pursuit of destiny. The Persian Empire had been shattered, and a young king had begun to carve a path that would echo across centuries. The battlefield of Gaugamela was a storm of chaos and shattered resolve. Dust and blood hung thick in the air, the cries of men and horses weaving into a grim symphony that seemed to echo across the ages. Alexander, his armor streaked with dirt and sweat, moved like a shadow through the remnants of what had once been the mightiest army in the world. Every step he took was measured, every command deliberate. The Macedonian soldiers, though exhausted, followed him with unyielding loyalty, their eyes reflecting the fire of victory and the weight of witnessing history unfold before them. Across the field, the Persian forces had been broken but not entirely destroyed. Small bands of cavalry attempted desperate flanking maneuvers, hoping to regroup and strike back at the heart of the Macedonian formation. But Alexander's eyes missed nothing. He had anticipated these movements, positioning reserves with precision, directing units to cut off escape routes and isolate the pockets of resistance. The Persian commanders, once confident in their overwhelming numbers, now fled from one disaster to another, their formations dissolving into chaos with every passing moment. Alexander's infantry pressed forward, spears thrusting through the remnants of the enemy lines. Cavalry circled behind, cutting off any chance of retreat. The Macedonians moved as if one organism, coordinated, disciplined, unstoppable. Alexander himself led several charges directly into the stubborn pockets of Persian resistance, each action reinforcing his soldiers' morale and striking terror into the hearts of those who still stood against him. The battlefield had become not just a place of combat but a stage for strategy, courage, and the raw force of will. The Persian chariots, once a terrifying engine of destruction, had been neutralized. Alexander had studied their patterns, predicting their charges and directing his men to absorb and deflect their momentum. Horses were thrown, wheels shattered, and soldiers thrown into disarray. With every successful counter, the Macedonian army tightened its grip, and the psychological impact on the remaining Persian troops was immediate and devastating. Fear spread faster than the swords, and retreat became the only option for those who had not yet fallen. Darius III, realizing the inevitable collapse of his forces, fled further into the north, abandoning the battlefield to Alexander entirely. His retreat was frantic and disorganized, leaving Persian soldiers leaderless and vulnerable. Alexander seized the moment, pushing his cavalry to strike at the fleeing troops, turning panic into total defeat. Every soldier who had once considered themselves invincible now faced the brutal truth. The Macedonians, though fewer in number, had turned strategy and discipline into a weapon far deadlier than any sword or spear. As the day wore on, the scale of the Macedonian victory became undeniable. Fields that had once been alive with the energy and power of Persia were now strewn with the broken remnants of war, discarded weapons, fallen horses, and men lying where they had fought with valor and despair in equal measure. Alexander moved among his men, ensuring no one broke ranks, no opportunity was wasted, and every act of heroism was acknowledged. He understood that this battle was more than a victory. It was the beginning of a transformation that would echo for centuries. The Macedonians had not only defeated an empire, they had shattered the illusion of invincibility surrounding it. Every maneuver, every charge, every disciplined thrust of spears had reinforced the lesson that skill, strategy, and unwavering will could triumph over sheer numbers and brute strength. Alexander's leadership had been absolute, every action measured, every decision critical, and every risk calculated. The Persian army, once thought unstoppable, lay in ruins, and the young king's reputation as a military genius was cemented forever. Even as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cries of the wounded and the dying lingered on the plains. Alexander, standing atop a small rise, surveyed the battlefield with the calm of a man who had expected victory yet felt the weight of its cost. His men gathered around him, weary but proud, knowing they had been part of something monumental. The Macedonian victory at Gaugamela was complete, but it was not merely a triumph of arms. It was a triumph of vision, courage, and the unshakable determination of a single man whose ambition would shape the future of the known world. The battlefield lay silent in the aftermath of Gaugamela, but silence was a deceptive veil. Alexander moved among the Macedonians, his eyes scanning the horizon, noting every fragment of resistance that still lingered. The Persian soldiers who had survived the chaos of the day were scattered, disoriented, and leaderless. Their formations had dissolved completely, yet here and there small pockets clung stubbornly to the idea of resistance. Alexander's mind did not allow a single opportunity to escape. Every soldier, every chariot, every fragment of the defeated army could either be a threat or a lesson, and he would ensure that the lesson of Gaugamela would echo across Persia. He ordered his cavalry to pursue the fleeing troops, cutting across the plains with lethal precision. The Macedonian horsemen moved like shadows over the broken landscape, striking those who hesitated, driving fear into the remnants of what had once been a mighty army. Spear met shield in desperate clashes, men fell, and the sound of chaos returned, this time on a smaller, more fragmented scale. Alexander did not lead these attacks from afar. He was at the center, directing, inspiring, and fighting alongside his men. Every action reinforced the discipline, courage, and unbreakable cohesion that had carried them through the day's triumph. In the center, the Macedonian infantry pressed methodically through what remained of the Persian lines. Spears pushed forward, shields held tight, and each soldier moved as if they were a single entity, their will aligned with the vision of their king. Where a group of Persian troops attempted to regroup near the river, Alexander had anticipated them. His detachment of cavalry surrounded and cut them off completely. The survivors, faced with no choice, surrendered, their morale broken beyond repair. Every step Alexander took across the battlefield was a reminder that victory was not accidental. it was earned through strategy, foresight, and relentless action. As the day progressed, Alexander's attention shifted to the remnants of the Persian command. Darius III's retreat had left many officers scrambling to salvage what they could, but their cohesion was gone. Alexander moved deliberately, sending cavalry to intercept fleeing chariots, directing infantry to secure key positions, and ensuring that no Persian force could regroup and threaten the Macedonians. Each engagement reinforced the psychological dominance he had established that day. The survivors were learning that Gaugamela was not just a defeat, it was a demonstration of inevitability, of power exercised with intelligence and foresight. Amidst the pursuit, Alexander also surveyed the human cost. The plains were littered with the fallen, and while Macedonian soldiers tended to their wounded, he himself acknowledged the gravity of what had occurred. Victory was not merely measured in numbers of dead or fleeing enemies, but in the survival of strategy and the proof of disciplined courage. He understood that to fully secure his conquest, he would need to consolidate control, integrate new territories, and ensure that the message of Macedonian supremacy was unambiguous. The remnants of Persia, scattered and demoralized, tried to find shelter or regroup under smaller banners, but Alexander's forces were methodical. Every gap, every potential threat was addressed. Cavalry circled isolated pockets, infantry secured strategic positions, and even the smallest Persian group that resisted found themselves trapped between coordinated units that moved with near telepathic understanding. It was as if the Macedonian army were a single living entity, directed by the mind of its king. By the close of day, Alexander surveyed the landscape once more. The plains of Gaugamela, which had been a theater of monumental conflict, now lay in ruins, the remnants of one of history's greatest empires scattered and broken. Yet even in the victory, Alexander's mind turned ahead. He was aware that conquering the remnants, securing borders, and maintaining discipline would require the same vigilance, courage, and foresight that had carried him to this triumph. The Macedonian army rested only briefly, aware that history demanded momentum, and that hesitation could allow a shattered but determined enemy to rise again. The echoes of Gaugamela's battle would resonate far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of Alexander's brilliance, of his calm yet commanding presence, and of the unyielding discipline that had allowed a smaller, outnumbered army to defeat the mightiest force of the age. Every step he took reinforced the lesson that leadership, courage, and strategy could bend even the largest empire to the will of a single, determined individual. In the gathering twilight, Alexander knew that the battle was not entirely over, but the most crucial part had been won. Persia's armies had been shattered, their king in retreat, and Macedonian dominance now extended across a land that had once seemed unconquerable. Every surviving Persian soldier, every officer, and every fleeing chariot carried the memory of Gaugamela, an indelible mark of Alexander's genius, discipline, and audacity. The plains of Gaugamela had fallen into a heavy silence, the echoes of clashing swords and the cries of the fallen fading into the distance. But the silence was not peace, it was the aftermath of a storm the likes of which the world had never seen. Alexander moved among his soldiers, each step measured, eyes scanning the battlefield for the smallest sign of resistance. The Macedonians, exhausted but unwavering, followed him closely, their armor scarred, shields dented, and faces smeared with dust and blood, yet their spirit unbroken. They had witnessed the collapse of one of the greatest empires of the world, and every man knew he had been part of something monumental. Alexander's mind was already several moves ahead. He understood that winning the battle was only the beginning. Persia's armies had been shattered, yes, but remnants could regroup, villages could harbor deserters, and the memory of Darius III's command could inspire pockets of renewed resistance. Every action, every decision in the next hours, could determine whether the Macedonian victory would echo as permanent dominion or be forgotten in the chaos of time. He organized his forces carefully, sending scouts to track fleeing units, assigning cavalry to intercept stragglers, and ensuring that infantry secured key positions across the plains. Every corner of the battlefield was controlled, every potential threat neutralized. As Alexander rode across the field, he took note of the psychological impact his victory had left on both sides. Macedonian soldiers carried a newfound confidence, their loyalty and morale elevated to levels unseen even in previous campaigns. Every glance at their king reinforced their certainty that they were part of a legend, that their courage and discipline were inseparable from the brilliance of their commander. On the other hand, Persian survivors wandered in disarray, their morale shattered, their faith in leadership deeply eroded. Where once they had moved as a disciplined force, they now fled in panic or lingered hopelessly, unsure of the next command. Alexander understood that the conquest of minds was as critical as the conquest of lands. He paused briefly to survey the scene, noting the scattered remnants of Persian banners, broken chariots, and the still forms of the fallen. Even in victory, there was a human cost, and Alexander acknowledged it silently. The bravery displayed on both sides demanded respect, even from an enemy crushed beneath his strategy. Yet he allowed no hesitation. Every moment was a chance to solidify dominance, every action an opportunity to ensure that Gaugamela was not merely a victory in battle, but a turning point in history. The Macedonian army began systematically consolidating the battlefield. Units moved to collect the wounded, treat the dying, and gather intelligence from captured soldiers. Every Persian officer taken prisoner was questioned, revealing not just tactical weaknesses but insight into the structure of a crumbling empire. Alexander's intelligence network, small yet precise, began to map the fractured Persian command, predicting potential uprisings, tracking routes of retreat, and identifying towns and fortresses that required immediate attention. Each move reinforced Macedonian supremacy and demonstrated that conquest extended far beyond the battlefield. Amidst the work of consolidation, Alexander addressed his soldiers, not with grand speeches but with the simple force of presence and understanding. He praised their courage, acknowledged their exhaustion, and reminded them of the scale of their achievement. Every man felt the weight of history on his shoulders, and every man understood that they were participants in a story that would be told for centuries. Tales of Gaugamela would not fade. They would be remembered as the moment when a smaller, disciplined force overcame an empire through strategy, courage, and the unshakable will of a single visionary leader. Yet Alexander's attention was not solely on the battlefield. His mind considered the broader consequences. Persia had been the heart of a vast empire, and its people, soldiers, civilians, administrators, were now confronted with a new reality. Alexander knew that to secure lasting control, he needed to understand their culture, their loyalties, and their fears. Orders went out to his officers to maintain discipline among the Macedonians, treat prisoners with calculated fairness, and integrate conquered territories into the expanding realm with both firmness and pragmatism. Victory was not merely about destruction, it was about establishing an enduring legacy. As night fell, the plains bore witness to a Macedonian army that had endured unimaginable challenges, navigated a battlefield of epic proportions, and emerged triumphant against overwhelming odds. The soldiers gathered their fallen comrades, tended to their wounded, and prepared for the next phase of the campaign. Alexander remained vigilant, understanding that the true test of leadership came not in achieving victory, but in ensuring it endured. The psychological imprint of Gaugamela extended beyond the soldiers and commanders. Towns and villages throughout the Persian Empire would soon learn of the Macedonian dominance. Merchants, farmers, and local governors would feel the ripple effects of the battle, fear, respect, and the inevitability of Alexander's rule. Even distant regions, untouched by the battle itself, began to perceive the shift in power. Alexander had not only won a battle, he had reshaped the perception of authority, strategy, and destiny across an entire empire. The Macedonians, weary but triumphant, understood the full scope of what they had achieved. They had witnessed firsthand that courage and discipline could overcome sheer numerical superiority. They had seen strategy triumph over arrogance and intelligence over brute force. And they had followed a man whose vision, precision, and relentless will had carved a new path in history. By the end of the night, Alexander surveyed the battlefield one last time. The Persian army was shattered, Darius III had retreated into uncertain exile, and the Macedonians had solidified their control. The plains of Gaugamela, once a theater of fear and destruction, now bore the mark of a new era, an era defined by the audacity, genius, and indomitable will of Alexander the Great. History itself had been reshaped, and the legend of a king who could bend empires to his vision had begun in earnest. The aftermath of Gaugamela did not allow for rest. Alexander understood that a shattered Persian army was only the beginning, and that securing an empire required far more than battlefield dominance. As his troops moved across the plains, he coordinated the pursuit of remaining Persian forces, ensuring that no organized resistance could regroup in towns or along the rivers. Cavalry units scoured the countryside, intercepting fleeing chariots, while infantry secured key routes and strategic passes, transforming the chaotic landscape into a controlled stage of Macedonian authority. The genius of Alexander was not only in striking fear or destroying enemies, it was in preparation, in logistics, in anticipating every challenge before it emerged. Supply lines were established with precision, allowing the Macedonians to move forward without the crippling exhaustion that often crippled victorious armies. He ensured that food, water, and medical attention reached his soldiers, sustaining morale and readiness even after the brutal hours of battle. Every decision was deliberate, measured, and calculated to maintain the momentum that had brought him victory at Gaugamela. Beyond logistics, Alexander turned his attention to governance and integration. The territories they had now secured were vast and complex, populated by cultures, leaders, and citizens who had once owed allegiance to Persia. Alexander dispatched officers to establish order, integrating local administrators and incorporating Persian soldiers willing to serve under his command. The Macedonians enforced discipline among themselves, respecting the conquered population enough to prevent rebellion while projecting the absolute authority of their king. The psychological impact of this approach reinforced Macedonian dominance more effectively than any weapon could. While marching deeper into Persian lands, Alexander reflected on the lessons of Gaugamela. Each movement, each victory, each strategic choice was part of a larger design to reshape the political landscape. He encouraged his commanders to document intelligence, to learn from every engagement, and to anticipate the next moves of a king still at large. Darius III, though in flight, remained a figure whose influence could inspire pockets of resistance if left unchecked. Alexander's meticulous planning ensured that the momentum gained would be unrelenting and decisive. In the days that followed, Alexander also focused on his men. Soldiers who had witnessed the ferocity of Gaugamela were battle-hardened but exhausted. He moved among them, acknowledging their bravery, reminding them of the scale of their achievement, and reinforcing the vision that had guided them through the chaos. Their loyalty, tempered by both fear and respect, became the foundation upon which he would continue to build an empire. The psychological cohesion of his forces was as critical as the physical control of conquered territories. Alexander's campaign through Persia became a demonstration of mastery over both land and mind. Towns once under the shadow of Persian authority were brought under Macedonian control with calculated efficiency. Any resistance was met with decisive action, every surrendered city was integrated carefully, ensuring that the population would accept a new order without igniting rebellion. Diplomacy and strategy intertwined seamlessly with the threat of force, and Alexander's reputation as both a military genius and a cunning ruler grew with each march. Even as he advanced, Alexander maintained an unbroken awareness of the human cost of conquest. He ensured that wounded soldiers were treated, that the spoils of war were distributed to maintain morale, and that prisoners were interrogated for intelligence rather than executed recklessly. Every action reinforced his authority while demonstrating that Macedonian rule was organized, disciplined, and inescapably dominant. The psychological impact on both his own troops and the remaining Persian forces was profound. By the time the army reached the borders of Media and further into the heartlands of Persia, Alexander's control was absolute. Resistance, while not entirely extinguished, had been fragmented and neutralized. The Macedonian army, though fatigued, remained cohesive and efficient, a living instrument of strategy guided by a leader who understood both the art of war and the demands of empire. Each victory, each city integrated, each fleeing officer intercepted, built not just power, but the legend of Alexander the Great, a figure whose will could reshape the very course of nations. Even in these stretches of seemingly calm consolidation, Alexander remained vigilant. Every movement of remaining Persian forces was anticipated, every town secured, and every ally integrated into his command structure. The campaign was as much about intelligence, logistics, and governance as it had been about blood and battle. His understanding that true victory lay not merely in defeating an army, but in shaping the political and social structure of conquered lands, set him apart from all other rulers of his age. By the end of Section 6, the Macedonian Empire had solidified its position across Persia. Alexander's combination of military genius, logistical mastery, strategic foresight, and psychological insight ensured that Gaugamela was not an isolated triumph but the cornerstone of a lasting empire. Every soldier, every commander, and every conquered citizen had felt the weight of his strategy, the precision of his planning, and the inevitability of his ambition. The stage was now set for the final consolidation of power, the shaping of history, and the enduring legend of a king whose vision extended far beyond any battlefield. The air over the plains of Persia had begun to cool, the sun dipping low beyond the horizon, casting long shadows over the broken remnants of what had once been a proud and feared empire. Alexander stood atop a small rise, surveying the land with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the very essence of the territories before him. The Macedonian army stretched across the plains, a living testament to discipline, courage, and the unyielding will of its king. Each soldier bore the marks of battle, scars that spoke of survival, determination, and the relentless pursuit of victory. The remnants of the Persian forces, scattered and demoralized, tried to cling to hope in isolated villages and fortified towns. Alexander, however, had anticipated every possible regrouping. His cavalry, swift and merciless, moved through the countryside with precision, cutting off escape routes, capturing officers, and integrating surrendered soldiers into his own ranks. Infantry secured key locations, fortresses, and river crossings, ensuring that the flow of information and control remained firmly in Macedonian hands. Every step was calculated, every maneuver reinforced the inevitability of his dominance. Even in these final movements, Alexander's mind was not solely focused on military conquest. He understood that true power was not merely in subjugating armies but in shaping the hearts and minds of people. Local leaders were approached with calculated diplomacy. Those who resisted were met with decisive force, and those who submitted were incorporated into a governance system designed to ensure loyalty and order. The balance of fear and respect, brutality and strategy, became the foundation upon which he would establish an enduring empire. The Macedonians, weary yet unwavering, moved through towns and villages, encountering civilians who had once feared Persian rule. Alexander's presence, calm yet commanding, reassured his men and projected an aura of inevitability to all who witnessed it. Soldiers who had marched hundreds of miles, fought under a blazing sun, and survived chaos beyond comprehension now felt the weight of accomplishment, their loyalty to their king cemented by both fear and admiration. Every moment on the field reinforced the psychological imprint of Macedonian superiority. Alexander's strategies had not only defeated armies but had dismantled the very perception of invincibility surrounding the Persian Empire. Officers who survived spoke of his tactical brilliance, of the speed with which he anticipated maneuvers, and of the unyielding courage with which he led from the front. Even ordinary soldiers, those who had faced the terror of chariots and the roar of spears, recognized that they had been part of something greater than themselves, a story that would echo through generations. In the midst of consolidation, Alexander also reflected on the lessons of leadership. True command required vision, decisiveness, and the ability to inspire. Every victory, every decision, every calculated risk had been a testament to his understanding of both warfare and human psychology. He ensured that Macedonian troops were treated fairly, that logistics supported their continued effectiveness, and that discipline was maintained without stifling morale. His army was not just a force of conquest, it was an embodiment of strategy, foresight, and relentless will. As dusk fell and fires burned across the plains, Alexander convened his commanders. Together, they reviewed the battlefield, the movement of troops, and the integration of conquered territories. Orders were given to fortify positions, to establish supply lines, and to continue the pursuit of remaining Persian forces. Every action reinforced the authority of the Macedonian Empire and the inevitability of Alexander's vision. History, in that moment, was being written not in scrolls or words, but in the calculated steps, courage, and discipline of a single man and his army. The soldiers, reflecting on the days of relentless combat, recognized the magnitude of what they had achieved. They had witnessed genius in motion, discipline in chaos, and the shaping of a new world. Tales of Gaugamela, once distant and abstract, had become lived experience, etched into memory, into flesh, and into the collective consciousness of every man present. They understood that their names, their bravery, and their loyalty would be remembered as part of a story far greater than any single battle. And yet, Alexander's work was not done. Even as night settled, he moved through the ranks, ensuring cohesion, reinforcing strategy, and preparing for the consolidation of a vast empire. The Persian Empire, though shattered, remained populated by millions whose loyalty had to be secured and whose resistance had to be neutralized. Each town brought new challenges, each interaction demanded both diplomacy and authority, and every moment required the unflinching attention of a ruler who understood that legacy was built on action, not mere words. In these final hours, the Macedonian army had become an instrument of history itself. The soldiers moved as one, responding to commands with instinctive precision, inspired by the presence of their king and the clarity of his vision. Every victory of the day had psychological consequences, every captured officer a lesson, every integrated territory a testament to strategic mastery. Alexander's genius extended beyond the battlefield. It was woven into the very fabric of the empire he was creating. And now, as the fires flickered under the vast Persian sky, Alexander turned to his soldiers, speaking not of conquest but of destiny. "We have faced the greatest army the world has known," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, "and we have prevailed. But the story does not end here. What we have begun, the discipline, the strategy, the courage, must continue. We are not just victors, we are the architects of history itself." It was in that moment that every soldier understood the truth of their journey. They were not merely Macedonians. They were participants in a legend, a story that would be told across centuries, a story of a king whose mind, courage, and unyielding will had bent empires to his vision. The echoes of Gaugamela would resonate forever, not just in tales of battle, but in the very understanding of what leadership, strategy, and destiny could achieve. And if you want to witness more of such stories, to feel history as it unfolded, to experience battles, legends, and the rise of empires as if you were there yourself, then subscribe to the Dark Spire. Step into the shadows of history, follow the footsteps of kings, and let every story pull you deeper into the past. Because history is not just something we read, it is something we live.